I wanted to share something that happened to me when I was a teenager, trying to make my own money. This was way back before cell phones and computers, where I would get the paper and sit there for hours circling and crossing out the classified section. Just to show you the approximate decade that we're talking about here, I was going to be starting college in the fall, and I was broke. I had a part-time job but wasn't making much money there. I was hoping to save up some before starting college so that I had some free time. I wanted to enjoy my college days and was not liking the idea of only ever having time to go to class and work. I wanted to find a summer job that made a decent amount of money. So, I was scouring that paper trying to find anything I could. Eventually, I did find one that, to be honest, seemed too good to be true. And I should have stopped and listened to myself there. It was listed as a retreat guide for a spiritual retreat center. The pay was given in a lump sum and at the end of the time because it was going to be 2 months long, starting in mid-June and ending in mid-August. At the time, I thought it was a good deal because, while you did have to stay there for the duration, they covered the cost of your room, food, and entertainment. To me, it sounded like a free vacation and I would get paid for it. So yeah, being naive, I jumped on the opportunity. My dad thought that it sounded nice. My mom was a little curious at first because she had never heard of the retreat before and wasn't familiar with it. But my dad and I both convinced her that it was fine. She was worried about her young daughter going camping with strangers, but I explained that it was a spiritual retreat, so I was expecting it to be religious. My family wasn't exactly church people, but they believed in something. So I think that convinced them too that I would be in good hands. I gave them a call to set up an interview, and they asked me to come in that same day. I rushed to get ready and make myself presentable, and then met them in a small building with a sign above it that said something like the Awakening Center. Inside, the building looked kind of empty, but I was greeted by a middle-aged woman in a white sundress. She introduced herself and apologized for the shape of the building, as she said they were just getting moved into it, which did make sense. The entrance had a small desk that she was at with 2 folding chairs in front of the desk. There was a plant in the corner and a sign directing people to the auditorium in the back. The interview was quick and seemed more centered around my soft skills. She wanted to know if I was capable of doing manual labor, such as cleaning, picking things up, and maybe even assisting with some construction. I was honest and explained that I had never done any kind of construction work. I was a 19-year-old girl. But I did say that I was willing to learn. She also went over how having an open mind was a must with people, and again, I just took it at face value, since it was called the Awakening. I figured it was religious, and maybe not even one that I was interested in. Hey, I was just there to work for them. I didn't care what they believed in. She seemed satisfied with my answers, and to my surprise, she hired me on the spot. She gave me an ID of sorts to use while I was there and directions to the grounds they would be using, and said that she would give me more of a rundown when I arrived. I went home ecstatic that I got the job so easily, and began preparing my bags for what I wanted to take. Approaching the grounds, there was a large gravel area in the front, where there were several cars parked, including a van with the same logo on it. Behind it was a cabin-like building with a tall wooden privacy fence surrounding it so you couldn't see in the back. To my surprise, the woman that had interviewed me, who I'll call Beth, was sitting on the porch with a handful of pamphlets and a clipboard. I watched her write something down when a man walked up and motioned him inside. When I walked up to her, she gave me a quick rundown of the plans for the day and led me inside after having someone else cover for her spot. That's when I noticed everyone in there was wearing white. The women in white dresses, the men in white pants and a shirt. I assumed it was part of the uniform or required attire. it wasn't my business either way. Anyway, Beth first showed me to my room in that same building that was down a long hallway. There was a bunk bed, and she said that the other helpers would be bunking with me. I was a little disappointed, thinking I would have my own place, but I couldn't complain. It was all paid for. Once I sat my bags down, she asked me for my size so that she could get me my clothes. I mentioned that I had brought my own, but she said they had uniforms you had to wear. Again, I just thought, of course, probably to tell the staff apart, and then when I wasn't working, I could wear my own clothes while I explored. She then led me around the rest of the building that included a large dining area, the kitchen. She showed me where the supply closets were and went through the rules along the way. After all the touring, we were then at the back of the building, and she said that she would show me the, quote, living grounds, as she put it. She looked pretty excited to show me, so I assumed the back must have been where all the fun stuff was. The back walls were lined with smaller cabins. From the outside, they were probably big enough to fit a small bedroom and bathroom, and that's it. So I guess you were expected to have dinner in the cafeteria. I did see a trail that went into the trees in the back, and dead center was a large gazebo-like area that Beth explained was their meditation hall. She said they gathered there 3 times a day, and that was their quiet hours. No one was to talk, eat, use the bathroom, etc. during that time, as it was their chance to reconnect with their true nature and the cosmic energy that binds us all, or something to that effect. I assumed that would be my own time to do whatever I wanted in my room, so I didn't disturb them. After the tour, Beth took me back to my room where someone had placed some kind of uniform on the desk, and Beth told me I could get changed and meet her in the kitchen. That was the first moment I'd had to myself, to really gather my thoughts and take it all in. I didn't know a single person there, but everyone seemed nice. Everyone I saw was probably middle-aged or so. I saw a few people there with kids, at least 2 younger people, and some that were old enough to be my grandparents. But everyone smiled and waved as we walked around, and they held the doors open for us, so I felt comfortable. I didn't feel like I was about to be treated like some lowly worker, and I thought maybe this came with the territory, with their religion and mission. I changed into their uniform, which oddly enough was a plain white dress, much like Beth's. I did think it was strange, especially if they expected me to do more strenuous labor, but I didn't think too much on it. I was honestly still pretty excited about the whole situation. Dinner was a bit different than I was used to. They called out that they did not consume any meat or animal products, and all the produce they had was grown in their own gardens. This made sense, because it was just a vegetable soup with bread and a salad. It did taste pretty good, though. Afterwards, they went to the gazebo for meditation, and I started walking toward my room and noticed a lot of people watching me at that point, with raised eyebrows. I thought it was weird, and I didn't know why I was being watched, but I just continued on my way. From then on, I learned pretty quickly that I was not there to simply work for them. This was their way to get more followers in the door. No one came to get me the rest of that night, but the following morning, Beth was at my door looking disappointed. She asked me why I wasn't at the meditation, and I mentioned it wasn't my thing, and I figured that I shouldn't bother them. She told me that everyone was required to attend, staff included. I told her that I wasn't interested, but she very sternly told me that it wasn't an option, and if I didn't attend, I would have to leave. Being prideful and already wasting the time going out there, I finally agreed to attend. I figured I could just grin and bear it and move on. But I didn't realize, until that morning after breakfast, that it lasted for 2 hours. In 2 hours, we all crammed ourselves into this gazebo in the hot summer sun, sitting silently cross-legged with our eyes closed. I would peek around and see a few people, like Beth, walking around the perimeter and making hand motions to the others doing the same. That was the first time I was kind of scared. Why were they watching us so hard? Why would it matter if someone didn't do this? At the end of each session, a man would come out and talk to all of us. I assumed this was the leader or pastor or whatever they called him. He mentioned at the first one I attended that he had a spiritual awakening after a near-death experience. And since then, he felt it was a sign to help others awaken to their cosmic consciousness. This was sounding a bit more out there than what I was expecting. But once again, being 19, I thought I could get through it, make my money, and then just never see these people again. But again, things would escalate, and I started to feel unsafe. Between the painfully long meditations, I would then quickly have to help clean and prepare for dinner. They only served breakfast and dinner. And if I didn't do something completely accurate, like using too much soap, I would be reprimanded. If I woke up late or took too long to get ready, I would be reprimanded. And their choice of punishment was typically either an extra meditation session or a skipped meal. They didn't have snacks or extra things like that to eat, so there were a few days that I went with only one meal. I also finally got a roommate, but to both of our surprise, it was a guy that was 4 years older than me. He had also applied for a job and ended up here, but had to start late. At first, I was scared and confused that they would bunk me with a man, given their whole situation here. All the cabins were separated, unless there were couples there, so why would they bunk us together? Did they not have separate living quarters? Thankfully, after talking to the guy, he also thought it was really weird and we seemed to be the only two people questioning any of this. So, after explaining to him some of the things I had witnessed, we kind of began to watch out for one another. It was a few more grueling weeks of this, the meditation speech becoming more of an indoctrination of sorts. The lack of a good meal, because let's face it, you can only cook potatoes and carrots in so many ways, was starting to get to me. But then, one night, I saw something that told me I needed to get out of there before something happened to me. Sunday night, we had a gathering that once again everyone had to attend. But this time, the leader talked about how to gain their awakened consciousness, and referred to his experience. A man in the audience was brought to the podium with him and lied on a table beside the leader. The man explained that to understand, you must first die. Yes, he said you had to die. And everyone nodded, and they were all acting like this was the most sane thing that someone had ever said. When the leader was done speaking, he was handed a white cloth, twisted like a rope. He dipped it into a bowl of water, and then I watched as he wrapped it around this man's neck. I don't need to say more about what I witnessed, but after it was all said and done, he hit him on the chest several times, and one of the woman helpers standing nearby joined him in hitting, shaking, and smacking the man until he finally gasped. I was terrified. I just watched these people nearly kill a man, and for what? I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't want to witness this, and I was already fearing for my safety. Once back in my room, I started crying, and my roommate helped to comfort me and told me that I should leave. I told him that he should come with me because I was worried for him too, but he refused. He said that he would help me to make sure that I got out okay, but that he would stay because he wanted to take all this to the police. Clearly, he had been duped just like I had. They didn't need help, they needed victims. That night, I packed my bag and he followed me out the front door when Beth stopped us. She said that I wasn't allowed to leave in the middle of the retreat. Before I could say anything, the man argued with her that I was too young to be here. She tried to threaten me about the money, saying that I wouldn't get any of it, and I told her that I didn't want it. She then said that I wasn't allowed to copy any part of the retreat for my own benefit, and I laughed at that statement. Why the hell would I want any part of that? The man stood between Beth and I, telling me to go, and I didn't hesitate any longer. I left that building, tossed my bag in my back seat, and burned out of there without looking back. I drove home and cried in my confused parents' arms. I explained everything to them, what they did, the meditations, the uniforms, the strangling, and even the man that had helped me escape. And I felt guilty at that point. My mom immediately took me to the police station to report it. While there, they seemed skeptical at first, but as my mom pushed me to give them every little detail that I could think of, the cop seemed to begin taking me seriously. They said that they would look into it, took down our contact information, and then we left. I didn't hear much about what happened to the place after that. I know from my parents and from around the area that the cops did show up and ask about it, and the owners. I presume the leader told them that everyone was there willingly for a retreat, and when the cop asked if anyone wanted to leave, there were only 2 people that did. I don't know who it was, but I do hope that that man was one of them. But because no one was saying that they were being held there, they couldn't, or wouldn't, do anything further. I never heard from or about that man again, but I'm incredibly thankful that he gave me the courage to finally leave and to help me. I had already been there for about a month, and about a week in, he was already seeing everything wrong with the situation and was willing to risk his own safety to get me out of there. And for that, I hope he's doing okay. Clearly, it's been multiple decades since this took place, but it's definitely opened my eyes to some of the monsters that we may not recognize. I didn't take on any other odd jobs like that, and eventually, I settled on being a cleaner and stay-at-home mom, and it does fit me a lot better. I know finding jobs is a lot different nowadays, but to anyone out there desperate to find a job, especially younger people, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And if you ever feel unsafe in a job or situation, get out of there fast, because a legitimate business would never threaten your safety. Today we have a write-up on the Hillsong's Fall from Grace, written by a good friend of mine, Tom K. As such, some of the opinionated words or subjective statements made in the beginning are his and not necessarily mine. Just want to make that clear. This one will certainly be a convoluted one, as I do have some of my own reasons for being interested in this particular story, or scandal, as it were. It may come as a surprise to some of you that I'm not a terribly religious person. However, my family is a different story altogether. So, back in the late 2000s, my parents and sister actually were involved with a church called North Point Church. Now, I'm going to start this off with a little section about NPC and some of the things I ultimately ended up learning about them, and how all of this connects back to Hillsong. Sometime around 2006, my parents had discovered a brand new church in town that was really making a name for itself, kind of overnight. Everyone was really hyped up by the incredibly positive services that were full of very upbeat music. My sister even told me that it was more like going to a rock concert than a church. My parents had tried multiple times to get me to accompany them, but I never really have been much for going to church. However, in 2009, I found myself at a low point, and I ended up taking my parents up on their invitation to come to a service. The first thing I noticed was that this certainly was not a typical church building. If anything, it looked like a large version of a pole barn that had been enclosed and then had some interior work put in. Nothing that a solid crew couldn't come in and have taken down in time for the cattle auction, should the need ever arise. But the auditorium was definitely its own kind of spectacle. With a very large stage and lighting displays that would have made any rock band envious, lots of laser lights and intricate displays. I couldn't dispute the fact that the services were indeed very uplifting and positive. The pastor was incredibly charismatic and had a way of making you feel a part of something so much bigger than yourself. It was a very nice thing at first. I even started throwing into the collection plate from time to time, as I was able to do so. I wasn't going every week or anything, and after a couple of months, I started getting more invested in other things, and I kind of fell off going. Not too long after my last time of attending, my parents stopped inviting me. They stopped attending regularly, and they seemed much less excited about going. My sister was friends with one of the administrator's daughters, and at some point she kind of pulled me aside and started filling me in on some things. First, she started telling me why they had gradually started becoming less involved with NPC was because the services started becoming less positive. Over time, they had become a lot darker, and were hyper-focusing on certain things such as deception and infidelity. The more this became a trend, the more my family had kind of walked away when they did. My sister, however, maintained her friendship with the admin's daughter, and she got some really juicy bits of information that later on came out and scandalized the entire church and compromised its entire future. You see, there was a certain amount of tongue-in-cheek in some of those very on-the-nose sermons. It started becoming a known thing amongst the administrators that the pastor was, in fact, conducting multiple affairs with married women. By the time things were becoming public enough that it was a full-blown scandal, it was even deeper than just some extramarital affairs. The pastor was building a harem, a stated goal. While this was happening, other members of the administration were lining their pockets with money from the church's coffers, while pretending to look the other way at the pastor's dalliances. Now, I feel like I should take a minute here to explain that prior to all of this scandalous stuff coming out, it was common knowledge that NPC was, in fact, trying to get into Hillsong's worldwide network. Everything about the church from its earliest days was directly modeled on Hillsong, and they had opened a second church and were trying to turn it into an entire campus, much as Hillsong had in their major locations, such as New York. So, having all this in my head and hearing about the sheer scandal of the corruption at the highest ranks of this, what at the time was a rapidly expanding church, it really gave me pause. If this kind of thing was going on to the extent that it was, how could they possibly hope to become part of this massive worldwide church? And sadly, the answer to that is, what was going on at NPC was pretty par the course, and in many ways far more tame than what would later be found out about the going-ons within Hillsong. Now, I'm not going to sit here and inundate you with the entire history of Hillsong, but I will give a brief explanation because I'm sure at least some of the people hearing this know little, if anything, about Hillsong. So, I'll offer an outline here. In 1984, Brian Houston and his wife Bobby founded Hills Christian Life Centre in Balcombe Hills, New South Wales, Australia. Over the course of the 80s and 90s, the Hills CLC rapidly began to grow into a megachurch. What primarily fueled this astonishing growth was a huge influx of young people who were attracted to the church's contemporary brand of worship music. They also began very early on to seed other churches internationally, which also helped bolster the size and the reach of Hills CLC. The primary draw has always been the music of Hills CLC. In fact, the name Hillsong was originally the name of the band that performed at the services, but the music became such a driving force behind the growth of the church, and became so synonymous with the church, that it officially rebranded as Hillsong. The church even has its own brand, Hillsong Music Australia, which produces all of the music associated with the church and its subsidiaries. They have produced no fewer than 40 albums since 1992. Hillsong Live, later renamed Hillsong Worship, produced albums that all achieved gold status. The entire operation helps sustain the church in its constant global expansion. It's such a driving force in their revenue stream that Hillforce Music has sold more than 60 million albums and earns in the ballpark of $100 million a year. One of the ways that Hillsong has entrenched itself with modern worship is by licensing its music to other churches all over the world. If you've attended a Christian religious service any time since 2014, and the music was memorable and not exactly in the traditional hymnal style, then you've probably experienced Hillsong music, and never stepped foot in a Hillsong church. The Hillsong campus in New York is one of the largest in the world, and whoever provides over-the-world famous service is kind of a celebrity in their own right by default. Carl Lentz really took the Hillsong brand to a whole different level during his tenure at Hillsong NYC. He was young, very charismatic, and had a way of connecting with the audience in a way that felt like every word he said was being spoken directly to you, and only you. The sermons themselves were very powerful and moving, and everything about Carl just drew you in and made you want to trust him. In many ways, that would probably be considered the first red flag. He very much was that X factor. Always quick with a joke, and was just overall very magnetic and approachable kind of guy. Though it was also very clear that he cared a lot about his appearance and presentation. Carl always dressed well. His style was trendy, and you could tell that he spent no small amount of time staying in shape. Carl Lentz wasn't the only incredibly charismatic member of the church, though. Of course, the main point of contact in any church, especially one as large as Hillsong NYC, will be the other parishioners. And Hillsong NYC hosts one of the most diverse congregations anywhere in the world. Just showing up for a service, the people make you feel like you have always belonged there. Then, of course, are the welcome teams. Once you arrive, these people will do everything they can to make you feel, well, welcome. The sheer amount of positivity could possibly be overwhelming for some people. Carl Lentz is also highly memorable for his close relationship with Justin Bieber. During a time where being closely associated with the Biebs was kind of toxic for your image, Carl Lentz did not shy away from the troubled young man. In fact, he became something of a mentor to Justin. This could be seen as incredibly symbiotic as far as relationships go. For Justin, at a time when it really needed to seem like he was trying to improve himself, the public relationship with Carl Lentz was exactly what he needed. And for Carl to be around someone as in the mainstream public eye as Justin Bieber was, only pushed Hillsong more into that same mainstream flow. Now, millions of Justin Bieber fans were getting exposed to Carl Lentz, and that made them want to be a part of the same church as their icon. Some people even say that, at a certain point, Carl Lentz became more synonymous with Hillsong than Brian Houston. That's just how powerful his charisma was. Not to mention Carl was now the pastor to the celebrities. Justin Bieber was just the first of a number of famous people who began to attend Hillsong regularly. Eventually, there was even a VIP section for the celebrity parishioners to kind of have their own little space, effectively turning the church into a tiered society. At the time, Hillsong NYC was pulling in more money than any other Hillsong location on the planet, but the rifts that began to form between Brian and Carl would ultimately expose more corruption than anyone ever thought possible. Things had started racing towards a moment of critical mass that was going to leave the world in shock. All the warning signs were there. Carl was becoming more arrogant and full of himself. In his own way, Carl had become a cult leader to a lot of young people. There were clearly a lot of people that idolized him. They were dressing like him, trying to emulate him. Growing beyond the megachurch that he had taken into the stratosphere, Carl Lentz was now the most recognizable figure associated with the worldwide ministry of Hillsong. When dealing with something like spirituality and religion, you have to be so incredibly careful of your entire message. Your entire brand becoming too entangled with one person that has seemingly transcended the movement. Because, pastor or not, we are all human, and we are all one moment of poor judgment away from ruining our own lives and images, much less an entire religious organization. Carl Lentz was about to be an embodiment of this in all the worst possible ways, for himself, and especially for Hillsong. Prior to becoming the pastor of Hillsong NYC, Carl Lentz had attended Hillsong Bible College in Australia, where he met his wife, Laura. After graduating, Carl returned to his home in Virginia Beach, where he and Laura became the young adult pastors for Wave Church. The senior pastor there, Steve Kelly, worked at Hillsong Church for a decade before moving to Virginia Beach to become the senior pastor at Wave. As such, much of the style and structure of Wave was heavily influenced by Hillsong. Very early into Carl's tenure, things began to change. The culture, the values, the very community began to change. The role he had been selected to fill really just began to shift. His style was vastly different from what the attendees had been used to. Carl liked to exercise a little bit of control over the congregation. When it came to relationships and dating, he especially had a litany of rules that he expected everyone to adhere to. Things such as date for a whole year before you have your first kiss. Don't say I love you until you propose. While his predecessor had been more compassionate and understanding of relationship dynamics, Carl was not quite as gentle. He allegedly shamed couples, especially young women, who spoke to him in confidence about struggles with purity or told him they had engaged in premarital sex. Early on in his time at Wave, the recurring theme of sexual purity began to emerge in his sermons. This trend, as well as his attitude towards sex and relationships, would follow him into his service at Hillsong NYC. And, over time, it became an even more frequent topic during his services. It ended up being quite telling, really. The entire topic came up so frequently that a lot of people hearing these sermons kind of began to feel that this was something he struggled with, especially when he would openly say that before he met Laura, he was a, quote, player. In May of 2020, Carl began an extramarital affair with a woman named Rhiannon Karam, whom had actually attended Hillsong years prior. Everything ended up moving very fast and was very intense. Rhiannon and Carl were together for 5 months, during which time Carl manipulated and controlled this woman. If it wasn't convenient for him, or not what he wanted, then it just did not happen. It became very clear that he was the star of his own show, and everyone else was just a bit player. Multiple times when Rhiannon set to end the relationship, Carl just would not let her walk away on her terms. On November 4th of 2020, there was an announcement from Brian Houston saying that Carl Lentz was no longer part of Hillsong NYC. Carl reached out to tell the woman that he had been seeing that his wife knew, and the church knew, and that they had found out from his computer at his office. From there, Carl made a big post on Instagram, explaining everything that he and Laura had been both fired, despite Laura's conduct never having been an issue. During the final time that Rhiannon and Carl spoke, Lentz told her that he had paid a lot of money to keep her name buried, so no one would know who she was and for her not to worry. This did not really sit well with Rhiannon, who felt that Carl was trying to control her and dictate her story, while denying her a chance to speak for herself. So Rhiannon contacted a reporter, and the fallout from this entire mess would leave few things untouched. Although Brian Houston and Hillsong were distancing themselves from Carl, and while Carl was the first one to come out and admit his adultery to Brian Houston, he was far more vague with his wording in regards to Carl Lentz being fired. You see, It turns out that Carl Lentz already had a reputation as a womanizer going back to his days at Wave. Numerous people witnessed Carl making inappropriate advances towards women, or had their own experience with him acting inappropriately toward them. Also, in the days following Carl Lentz's dismissal, while Brian Houston had tried to say there had never been any indication of this kind of behavior from Carl before the affair with Rannon came to light, there had been in fact multiple reports of sexual impropriety brought against Carl Lentz by 2 former volunteers. The church, however, accused them of fabricating these allegations and dismissed them from their positions at Hillsong. A lot of people believe that, while there was no concrete evidence to support this, Carl Lentz was eliminated because there were rumors that Laura and Carl were about to leave Hillsong, and Lentz had become so much more popular than Brian, or the church itself, that he was going to take a huge number of people with him. And so, as kind of a parting shot, Brian Houston did his best to tarnish Carl's reputation, while trying to not make Hillsong look complicit in his immoral behavior, which it absolutely was. Because the entire time Carl was beneficial to, quote, the Empire, Brian Houston and most of the Hillsong administrators were happy to rake in the cash that Carl had attracted to Hillsong, and look the other way while Carl Lentz chased skirts and fame. But the moment he might be leaving, and taking money out of Hillsong's coffers, then he's fired for questionable leadership qualities and moral decision-making. I'm sorry to say that the entire scandal around Carl Lentz and his ultimate, if satisfying, downfall is not the real end to this story. No, it really was just the first crack in the facade of Hillsong and its image. After it further came out that Carl Lentz had been involved in a second affair, and he admitted to having an Adderall addiction during his time at Hillsong, there were a lot more eyes on Brian Houston and the upper echelons of the Hillsong hierarchy. The very notion that Brian Houston, the big boss of the largest church in the world, had no idea that things like this were going on only made people more curious. Carl Lentz was the superstar of Hillsong, and if he had been engaged in things like extramarital affairs while entertaining an illicit drug habit, how could someone like Brian Houston not know these kind of things were going on? And now, the Berg starts to become more clear. In the days that followed Carl Lentz's expulsion from the church, more and more stuff began to surface. Reports that ranged from mistreatment of volunteers, racism, sexual harassment, bullying were all becoming more common. Then, people began finding evidence that a lot of the church money was being paid out, and the reason for these payments was to silence victims. Silence victims? Silence whose victims? Well, that would be Frank Houston's victims. I'm not going to dive into the atrocities that are said to have been committed by Frank Houston, nor the ones committed by Brian. I'll just begin wrapping this up by saying that because Brian Houston decided to fire Carl Lentz, in what could be considered an act of pettiness trying to cite the affairs with Rannon as the excuse, he ultimately set the stage for his own downfall. Brian Houston and a lot of people got very rich while looking the other way as people indulged in despicable behaviors. Brian Houston also paid out a lot of money so people would overlook not only his father's horrific crimes, but inappropriate things that Brian Houston got up to as well. These days, Brian Houston is no longer the leader of Hillsong. When the crimes of his father, Frank, began coming to light, Brian Houston was arrested for his role in concealing these crimes. Houston resigned from his position as the global senior minister for Hillsong as a result of his arrest, and has since stepped completely aside and ended all association with Hillsong, although he allegedly has plans to form a new church in a new community, which was supposed to have begun in 2024. At the time of this writing, there is no real word on if this has actually gone anywhere. In the case of institutions like Hillsong and like NPC, I think it's bitterly ironic that the second these places become a success, the instant they become a success, then they have failed. Because as soon as a church, or more specifically, as soon as a man hits a certain level, and he can play jump rope with the line of morality and then just make his mistakes go away, and, quote, make it right by spending a little money on shushing a victim and their family up, that does seem to be the path even allegedly righteous men walk. Although, I think calling men like Frank and Brian Houston or Carl Lentz truly righteous men is more than a little bit absurd. That all probably goes without saying, though. Hey there, friends. Hopefully, you enjoyed this collection of scary cult stories. I don't do cult stories a lot, because I don't get a lot of cult stories. Obviously, I technically only had one story this video, and then one write-up by Mr. Tom K. Mr. Tom, if you will. Not really Mr. Tom. Tom's not his last name. Anyways. Yeah, but, you know, really, I think that's a good thing. Maybe. I said that out loud, and then I was like, well, maybe that's not a good thing, because maybe that means the people who have these stories can't report them. And that's not a good thing. What I was going to say is maybe that's a good thing because nowadays it's not as prevalent, but you know what? I'm going to just shut my mouth a little bit and stop talking. Anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed these cult stories. I enjoyed them, is a weird way to put it. They were good stories. The story that was submitted was very terrifying. Horrible to end up in that kind of situation. And then Tom's write-up on Hillsong was actually pretty interesting. I was not aware of what Hillsong was, and looking into it, it's an interesting story, so I appreciate him choosing that one to write up for the video. Yeah. Hopefully you all enjoyed this collection of stories. If you did, please do hit that like button. That would make you an amazing person. You're already an amazing person, but it would make you amazing +1. If you're feeling bold, you can go down below the video and leave me a comment with your thoughts. Have you ever had any sort of cult-like experiences? Hopefully not, but if so, and you want to share them, let me know. You can do so by emailing them to me at astheravendreams@gmail.com or sending them into the website at astheravendreams.com. On the website, there's a big button to submit your story, and I will happily accept them and read them if you send them in. The website is the preferred method, but it's not a requirement. If you want to email them, that's fine too. I typically just send them to myself through the website if you guys email them, because it makes it easier to keep them collected. So, yeah, you can also subscribe to the channel if you're new and liked what you heard. You can listen to the podcast on other platforms, such as Spotify, Pandora, Audible, etc., etc. Apple, if you're on that one as well. Probably more common than Pandora, Apple would be. But anyway, you can do a super thanks, which is a tip to the channel. Just kind of supports the channel a little bit. A couple dollars a video or a month supports way more than you guys know with how many people listen. And this is not me begging. I realize it may sound like it, so I'm going to say it anyways. If like half of the people that watch these videos did a $1 a month super, or joined memberships at the $1 a month, or Patreon at the $1 a month platform, it would be amazingly supportive to the channel and to the podcast. So, never expected. I just want to make sure you guys know that is an option. If you ever want to, joining memberships and Patreon does get you early access, so that is a big plus. The other tiers get you other things on Patreon, such as stickers, posters, other things that I'm trying to figure out what to give. I don't really know. I'm kind of like lacking on things to give out. So if y'all have any recommendations or things that would make you consider it if I gave it out, just let me know. Yeah, I'm yapping. So hopefully you're all having a beautiful day and a beautiful week so far. Hopefully I see you again here very soon. But until next time, remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important, you are the best you that you can be. Don't forget it. Until next time, my friends, much love and sleep well.